Hello, my name is Dr. Kurt Sander, and this is Music Theory Simplified. This is the third in our three-part series on seventh chords. And today we're going to be doing two things. The first is we're going to take a quick look at the qualities of seventh chords as they occur in the major and minor scale. And then we're going to look at the most important chord of all, the dominant seventh chord, and how composers resolve the 5-7, the dominant seventh, to a 1. And we'll talk a little bit about the strength of this chord, and then we're going to hear the three different ways that a composer will use the 5-7 to 1 in root position. So let's get started with the qualities of seventh chords in major and minor. Let's begin by looking at what we call diatonic seventh chords. This simply means if we take any pitch in a major or minor scale and build a seventh chord using the notes of that key, we find that there are certain qualities that occur naturally within the scale. If we do this in a major key, as shown here, we find that there are two places where we find a major seventh chord. And notice we use the little m to indicate major seventh. There are three places where we find a minor seventh, one place where we find a half diminished seventh, and then finally the dominant seventh quality, of course, appears in the dominant. When we look at minor, we find that there are different qualities based on the intervallic makeup of each seventh chord. We find two places where there are major sevenths, two places where there are minor sevenths, one half diminished on the second scale degree, one fully diminished, and finally the dominant seventh quality. Now you'll notice when we're talking about minor, we're using the harmonic minor scale for these two chords here, which means we're using that raised leading tone. And that is why the dominant seventh is dominant, whether you're in major or minor. But here's where I need to remind you, not all seventh chords are equal. They all have different functions, and some are used a lot more than others. By far the most important chord, the king of all seventh chords, is the dominant seventh. We find it used more than any other diatonic seventh chord. The importance of the 5-7 chord is summarized best by composer Richard Goldman, who says, "The demand of the 5-7 for resolution is, to our ears, almost inescapably compelling. The dominant seventh is, in fact, the central propulsive force in our music. It is unambiguous and unequivocal." This is a 5-7 in the key of C. Proper resolution of the dominant seventh requires an understanding of voice leading, or basically the tendency for certain pitches to go to other pitches. If we take the notes of the 5-7 chord and apply them to our C major scale, we can see that each chord member has a place in the scale. And by doing this, we can understand the functionality of each note. For example, the root will always be the 5th scale degree. The third of every 5-7 chord will be the leading tone, or the 7th scale degree. And the fifth of the 5-7 chord will always be the 2nd scale degree. And finally, the 7th of every 5-7 chord will be the 4th scale degree. And this is true regardless of the key. It's very beneficial to think about it in this way, because no matter what key you're in, the dominant 7th chord will always have these 4 scale degrees represented. And in resolving them, we have to think about those scale degrees and their melodic tendencies. Let me show you what I mean. If we look at the top 3 pitches of the 5-7 chord and where they occur on the scale, we can see that there's a tendency for them to move toward the more stable tonic pitches. Note how each of these pitches resolves to a chord member in the C major tonic. But how do each of these pitches move? Let's start with the easiest. This is the root of each chord, and if we have a 5-7 going to a 1, it makes sense that the 5th scale degree, the root of the 5-7, will go to the 1st scale degree, which is the root of the 1. And of course, this is true only in root position 5-7 to 1 progressions, which is the only type of progression we're going to cover in this particular video. Let's take a look at the other chord members and how they tend to function when we resolve the 5-7. The third of the 5-7 chord, which we know is the leading tone, or the 7th scale degree, in most cases wants to be resolved upward to the tonic. The fifth of the 5/7 chord, which is the second scale degree, tends to want to resolve downward, also to the tonic. And finally, the seventh of the 5/7 chord, which is the fourth scale degree, always wants to resolve downward. So when you look at how this chord has been resolved to the tonic 1, you can see that we end up with 3 roots, 1/3, and no fifths at all. We call this an incomplete triad, and it's actually the most common way a 5/7 is resolved to 1. If you recall, at the beginning of the video, I said that there were 3 distinct methods that composers use when resolving 5/7 to 1. Each of these requires a basic understanding of what we call voice leading, or how voices move from one scale degree to another. Let's take a look at these one by one, and you'll get a better perspective of how this 5/7 is used. Our first method is the most common. It involves a complete 5/7 going to an incomplete 1. Here we have a complete 5/7 chord in C major, and we have a root, a third, a fifth, and a seventh. Let's begin with the bottom note. Since its root position, a 5/7 to a 1 will be a 5 to 1, and that won't change in any of these 3 methods. The leading tone, or the third of the chord, will want to resolve up to the first scale degree. The fifth of the chord, which is the second scale degree, will resolve downward, and you can see we have 3 C's in this second chord. And finally, the seventh, or the fourth scale degree, goes to the third scale degree, and again we end up with 3 roots and 1/3, an incomplete 1 chord. Let's hear what this sounds like in an excerpt from Mozart's Coronation Mass. You can see here at the end we have a 5/7 to 1. Here is our 5 to 1 in the bass. Here is our leading tone, 7 to 1. Here is our 2 to 1. And finally our 4 to 3. And this is what it sounds like. Notice that the final chord, just like the other example, has 3 roots and 1/3, an incomplete 1. Our next method involves an incomplete 5/7 chord going to a complete 1. Let's recreate the chord that we had in our first example. A 5/7 in the key of C gives us a root, a third, a fifth, and a seventh. Now this is a complete 5/7, but remember what we're doing in this particular method is we're beginning with an incomplete 5/7 chord. So what's the note that we're going to get rid of? Well, we can't get rid of the root. That's the most important note. We can't get rid of the third. That gives us the major quality of that triad at the base of the dominant seventh. We certainly can't get rid of the seventh because then it ceases to be a 7th chord. So the only note we really can get rid of is the 5th. So let's go ahead and get rid of that blue note, the 5th, and we're going to replace it with another root, a doubled root, which is the 5th scale degree. So now we have 2 roots, a third, and a 7th. Now let's go ahead and follow the melodic tendencies of this chord. Just like before, the root does not change. 5 goes to 1. And the third of the chord, or the leading tone, will resolve up to 1 as well. And the 7th, which is the 4th scale degree, will resolve down to the 3rd scale degree. So what's going to happen to this root, this extra root that we have? Well, in this method, we actually maintain that common tone between the 5/7 and the 1. It's the 5th scale degree. So we're going to keep that. And now that we're done, we can see that our 1 chord has all of the chord members, root, third, and 5th. So this is an incomplete going to a complete. Here's how it sounds in the same Mozart Mass. Now the chances are you probably didn't hear much of a difference between that first example and this one. And that's because a lot of the voice leading is the same. We still have our 5-to-1, our 7-to-1, our 4-to-3, but the only difference is this subtle common tone, the 5th scale degree, that stays on the 5th scale degree. And as you can see, we have a complete triad at the end of this particular cadence. We have 2 roots, a 3rd, and a 5th. Now we come to our 3rd and final method for resolving root position 5-7-to-1, and this is a complete 5-7 going to a complete 1, but with what we call a frustrated leading tone. Let me explain what that means by putting the notes on the page again. Here we have a complete 5-7 chord, and we're going to follow the same voice leading, the 5-to-a-1, the 2-to-a-1, and the 4-to-a-3. This was exactly the same as our first method. The only difference here is that 7th scale degree, the leading tone, which normally went up to the tonic, giving us 3 roots, instead gets frustrated and goes down to the 5th scale degree in order to provide the 5th of the 1 chord. Now normally the leading tone wants to go up, but in this case it doesn't, which is why we say it's frustrated. Now it's very important, the only time this method occurs is when that leading tone is in one of the inner voices, either the alto or the tenor. And this is because it's less noticeable when it occurs in one of those voices. Let's listen to an actual frustrated leading tone in action. In this choral work by the Russian composer Arkhangelsky, this is his O Gladsome Light, and you can see that the end of the phrase has a 5-7-to-a-1, and the frustrated leading tone is in the alto voice. And it's frustrated in order to get a complete root 3rd 5th in the final 1 chord. This is what it sounds like. So I hope these 3 examples give you a good perspective on how the voice leading works in root position 5-7-to-1. Now remember, this is very important, this only applies when we're talking about root position 5-7 going to 1. When 5-7 occurs in inversion, it's actually much easier because we don't have that bass voice to deal with. Well, that's all the time we have for today's video. This is Dr. Sander reminding you, in music theory and in life, keep it simple.